You're probably familiar with the notion of low magic versus high magic fantasy settings, where some worlds are filled with magic to the brim, and in others, magic is so rare as to be considered something of legend, and of course, there exists everything in between. In classical fantasy literature, Conan would be a good example of a low magic setting, and even in the long history of D&D, some worlds vary in just how much magic they have, say Dark Sun, i.e. low magic, versus Forgotten Realms, i.e. high magic. One interesting question, though, that goes hand in hand with the question of quantity of magic in a certain setting, is just how much of a divine presence said setting has. Dark Sun, for example, has none, and other settings typically have gods. But how do these gods interact with the world and their worshippers? This is something that in fact varies quite a bit. To this end, we would like to explore the presence of the gods in the Forgotten Realms, from the perspective of how the gods interact with mortals on Faerun. How does divine intervention work in the Forgotten Realms? And why would gods intervene? For the purposes of this discussion, I will not use the Time of Troubles as an example, for a variety of reasons. As when the singular omnipotent overgod single-handedly casts down all of the gods of the pantheon in a whim, it is a bad example of a normal divine intervention in the world. Indeed, when we speak of conventional divine intercession, we are in fact speaking of events that involve the conventional gods participating in the lives of mortals, more specifically, their worshippers. To further elaborate upon the analogy of low magic and high magic, the setting of the Forgotten Realms is what I would call a high divinity setting, meaning that the gods play a very active role in the lives of mortals. But what are the rules of engagement? And what are gods permitted to do and not to do? That's a difficult question that perhaps does not have a perfect answer, but I'm nonetheless going to try to take a whack at it. The gods' behavior is ultimately mediated and regulated by the desires of Eu, the overgod, of which we know precious little. However, one thing we do know about the overgod is that he is focused on the notion of balance. Although this notion of balance is not well defined, we can nonetheless interpret it, based on his own words. The balance of the cosmos, as concerns Eu, implies that each deity fulfill their obligations to his or her portfolio and not deviate from this, and this means that gods must do what they represent. Mystra must create and promote magic, Leviator must promote pain and torture, Talos storms and destruction, and so on. There is the further consideration of just how much involvement is permissible concerning the gods and their followers. Inasmuch as gods do intercede, they must do so in their interest, which to some extent have been predefined by Eu. To understand what the limits of this are, one must first understand what I would call layers of intervention. The most common and even obvious intervention is the fact that clerics are empowered by their gods on a daily basis with spells. All fully fledged gods can grant spells to their clerics, and although this might not be seen as an intervention since clerics must pray for their spells, it is the most common interaction the gods have with their followers. Spells are granted on the basis of correctly following a deity's wishes and acting in accordance with the god's principles. If a worshipper or cleric deviates from this, it is entirely possible that he will no longer receive spells. Of course, for our real-world sensibilities, this might count as a kind of divine intercession, but such involvement is all too normal for the people of the realms. A level above simply granting spells to followers and priests is granting abilities and powers beyond mere spells, such as semi-permanent or permanent abilities, and powers that can be drawn upon at will. These are often granted for important missions and other grand occasions, and usually then only to especially favored members of a deity's church, though there are exceptions. Although this is a higher level of divine involvement than simply the granting of spells, it is neither likely to affect the divine balance of the world, nor is it especially noticeable. An example of this might be Clangedin Silverbeard, the dwarven god of war, granting a host of dwarven warriors the benefits of a collective strength spell before a pivotal battle with especially dangerous orcs. Though in this case such dwarves would not be clergy, but rather laity, who nonetheless are supporting the cause of the god, i.e. war. We can now move on to some of the most powerful examples and reasons for divine intervention. Many, if not most deities in Faerun, have servants that are referred to as chosen. Chosen are unique servants that are empowered by their respective gods with divine power on a level far beyond any conventional clerical servant. In most cases, there's only one chosen of a god, and such chosen can be seen as vessels of power, But here too, there are exceptions to this rule. Such agents are outfitted with diverse abilities that are often aligned with the interests of their gods. For example, the former Chosen of Bane, Fazul Chembril, had a mass of powers no normal priest of Bane had access to, such as the ability to summon death tyrants or undead beholders, as well as make multiple uses of powerful enchantment spells, such as dominate monster, suggestion, and gesh at will. Chosen status can be revoked by a deity if the chosen does not serve his god correctly, or if need be, as they carry the spark of the divine, they can serve as a source of power for a depleted god. And many gods during the period of time called the Second Sundering drew upon their chosen as sources of power, ushering a new era, which coincided, by the way, with a massive lore retcon on the part of Wizards of the Coast, and the emergence of 5th edition D&D. Hereafter, many of the old gods that had died or otherwise disappeared were reinstated. Now, probably the most famous of all chosen are the Chosen of Mystra, the goddess of magic, who, one could argue, is the most important goddess in the entire pantheon, as all magic and its functionality depends on her active vigilance and supervision of the weave. And unlike most deities that have but one chosen, Mystra has maintained several throughout her tenure as goddess. This probably corresponds with her status as perhaps the most important of deities, and the possible need to maintain multiple vessels of power. Some of these famous Chosen of Mystra have been the Seven Sisters, Elminster, the most famous wizard in the realms, and Samister, a fallen chosen, and the founder of the Cult of the Dragon. The most potent manifestation of divine intervention on the material plane, however, is the sending or appearance of an avatar. An avatar is a projection of a portion of the deity's power, not representing the entirety of a deity's potence. Deities, as a rule, are either not allowed to manifest themselves fully on the material plane, or simply cannot, and in order to project their power onto the material plane, an avatar is required. Avatars appear largely as the gods that send them do, albeit containing only a fraction of their power. Despite this, manifesting an avatar on the material plane is, in fact, a big deal, and sending an avatar is a major event on a scale hardly comparable to the granting of spells to clerics, or even the granting of powers to select church members, or for select causes. Avatar projection is so rare as to only occur once every few centuries, for a variety of reasons, because the interests of the deity in question must be greatly at stake for a deity to send forth an avatar. And beyond this, there's also the matter of balance of power. If it were nearly a daily occurrence that deities sent avatars to Toril, then the cosmic balance would suffer greatly, and thus, although there probably is no official prohibition on the frequency of avatar use, frequent deployment is discouraged. To illustrate the point, we can draw upon some historical examples of avatar deployment by deities. One example of this involves Moradin, the Allfather, chief god of the dwarves. Over 1,000 years ago, during the last days of a dying dwarf clan called the Iron Star, the clan's last king, Darvos Frostbeard, fell to orcs crossing the Stone Bridge, a massive bridge 2 miles long and 400 feet high, that also served as a temple to the god Moradin, the head of the dwarven pantheon. The clan was being overrun and slaughtered by orcs, and the dwarves stood no chance. Mortally wounded, as the orcs trampled over his broken body, with his dying breath the king cried out to the Allfather, begging him to aid his people, as he died falling into the depths beneath the bridge. Suddenly his body was pulled from the water by a 20-foot-tall avatar of Moradin, who cradled it in his arms, weeping tears for the loss of his child, outlined in blazing red flames and wielding a mighty warhammer. The avatar subsequently rallied the dwarves and stood against the orcs, decimating them until dusk, as his people retreated to safety. In this instance, there are probably several reasons why Moradin manifested an avatar. The king of a dying clan of his people, the dwarves, had died, and his people were in dire need. The dwarves as a race were also slowly dying out. It occurred within the temple to the god. And lastly, Moradin was sufficiently stirred to emotion. All these factors likely contributed to the avatar's manifestation. But conversely, one could imagine that if Moradin did this often enough, then the orcish god Gruumsh would probably feel very justified in retaliating by sending his own avatars to the material plane, which could then have knock-on effects such as the entire pantheon getting involved, which could lead to untold levels of destruction. Another instance of an avatar manifesting would be that of none other than Lathander himself. When the Archmage and former Chosen of Mystra, Samister, had decimated a band of harpers and priests of Lathander, Lathander, in righteous fury, sent an avatar to do battle with the evil Archmage. Samister had founded the Cult of the Dragon, an evil cult whose sole purpose it is to transform dragons into undead Dracoliches, based upon a very tenuous prophecy related to dead dragons. Here, the context is somewhat clear. Lathander's hatred of and strong opposition to the undead and evil, as well as the Cult of the Dragon's long and unhalted expansion, drove the god to engage directly with the cult's leader. Although avatars are probably the most powerful and rarest manifestations of divine power in the realms, gods on occasion do intervene in other ways, but such interventions defy conventional interpretation or classification. One such instance, again related to the dwarves, was the so-called Thunder Blessing. For many centuries, dwarven numbers had been in decline, and continued to dwindle. This was of such concern that Moradin himself convened a council of the dwarven pantheon, whose purpose it was to determine a solution to the dwarven population crisis. It was decided that each dwarven soul would be split into two upon reincarnation, which led to most dwarven births being twins for several decades. Although this was unconventional, the intervention and its reasons are fairly clear, as the entire dwarven pantheon participated and made the decision, most likely because the dwarves, their children, might have faced extinction had no such intervention taken place. Another example would be the Elven Pantheon. The Elven Pantheon has intervened at least twice on behalf of their people, and on both occasions in an effort to make sure that the high magic practiced by the elves actually ended up working. In the first instance, this involved the creation of the mystical Isle of Evermeet, the special island refuge of the elves, which literally tore out a chunk of the continent and relocated it thousands of miles away. And in the second instance, it involved the banishment of the Dark Elves and their transformation into the Drow. Both instances required the direct divine intervention of Corellin Larethian and the Elven Pantheon. And once again, we can see that the gods tend to intervene in this manner when the stakes are high as they pertain to their worshippers, which is particularly true of gods that represent entire races, such as dwarves and elves. And here I think I would be remiss if I did not offer some speculation of the prospect of divine intervention in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, which I frankly think is very likely, given all we know about the importance of the gods and their place in the story. The Dead Three are at the very least semi-divine entities, and it is not at all unlikely that we might interact firsthand with the likes of Kelemvor, Mystra, Selûne, or Shar. And if Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 are a precedent, which definitely have divine interaction and in some cases even divine intervention, I would not all be surprised if we saw some major interventions that affected the player and the story. Either way, I'm very much looking forward to seeing the gods in action in Baldur's Gate 3, divine intervention or not. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe as it really helps out the channel, and I will check you out next time. Take care.